This is Candle and Coffin. Let's uncover the forgotten truth beneath the ashes of history. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this story travels. It begins not with a trumpet, but with chains, not with the declaration of war or the march of generals, but with a slow hiss of steam rising from blood on sun-scorched stone, with a cry swallowed by dust, with a name that would vanish from all records save the whispers of terrified masters. His name, if it ever passed into ink, was lost in the fire that followed, burned away by those who feared what it represented, the possibility that a man born beneath a lash might one day raise his hand not just in protest, but in war. The year was 73 BCE, and the Roman Republic, bloated by conquest and trembling on the edge of corruption, had grown accustomed to seeing human beings as commodities, slaves to be worked, punished, traded, used. Among them, in the belly of Capua's gladiatorial school, there was one who waited, not prayed, not hoped, waited. His muscles were robed, his eyes not angry but deliberate, and though the scars on his back told of beatings past, his silence told of something worse, calculation. His name, as it is handed to us by history's reluctant chroniclers, was Spartacus. But before the name became legend, before the blood-soaked hills of Vesuvius, before the Senate trembled, before Crassus marched south, there was just a man and a whip and a choice, to kneel or to rise. This is not the story of rebellion as the powerful tell it, a mob of savages foaming for violence, but the slow burn unraveling of a world, built on other people's agony, a world where cruelty was law and defiance was death. And yet, in the cracks of that marble facade, something flammable had begun to smolder. The Roman Republic in these years was outwardly magnificent, its temples shining, its roads unbroken, its army stretching across Gaul and Africa and Asia Minor. But underneath lay rot, senators who bought their way into power, generals who looted provinces to pay off debts, and slaves, hundreds of thousands of them, worked until their hands bled and their names were forgotten. Spartacus had been a soldier once, perhaps a Thracian auxiliary, perhaps a deserter. Accounts differ, but what matters is not where he came from. It is what he saw in the arena. Men fought not for glory, but for bread, and the crowd did not cheer heroes. It demanded executions. Spartacus fought and killed and knelt and bled until the night he did not. The revolt began in the kitchens, not the barracks. A plot whispered over bread crusts and stolen knives passed between those whose languages barely align, Gauls, Thracians, Numidians, Greeks, but whose pain spoke fluently. When they broke free, they did not run. They raided, they armed themselves with cleavers and blacksmith hammers and stormed the road like a fever. Capua burned. The first soldiers sent against them laughed, thinking this a riot. They died with their throats cut in ditches. Rome, distracted by foreign campaigns and internal squabbles, sent men, then more men, then legions. Spartacus defeated them all. But this is not a tale of victory. This is a tale of warning and of flame. Because the real war was not between Spartacus and Rome. It was between the lie of civilization and the truth of its foundations. This is the story of a man who refused to accept the world as it was. A man who believed that dignity was not granted by birth, but seized by blood. A man who would rather die as a rebel than live as a tool. And in doing so, he set the empire on fire. Let us begin. There was no wind that morning on the Campanian plain, only the heavy breath of fields scorched by late summer and the faint rustle of sandals, moving too quickly for safety. The villa at the edge of Capua, once owned by a senator fat on provincial taxes, now reeked of smoke, horse sweat, and blood. Beneath its colonnade, the bodies of its former masters lay face down in their silk, throats open cleanly, like lambs, offered to a god no one dared name. Spartacus stood over them, bare-chested, the leather strap of a stolen Roman gladius digging into his shoulder, his eyes not on the dead, but on the horizon, always the horizon. Around him gathered the first fragments of the army that would haunt the dreams of Rome. Slaves wrapped in tunics too large for their frames. Ex-gladiators already sharpening their stolen steel. A few women clutching infants whose fathers still bled inside the villa. They were not soldiers. Not yet, but they had crossed the line that Rome feared above all. They had made a choice. No longer livestock, no longer tools. They were men. And men with nothing to lose were more dangerous than armies. Word spread like oil on marble, down the Appian Way, through the vineyards, into the lungs of trembling estate owners. Slaves rose in twos and threes, emboldened by a name, a rumor, a fire seen flickering on a distant hill. And every day they came. From kitchens and mines, from stables and quarries, from brothels and shipyards, they came. Not for vengeance alone, but for breath, for the right to live without kneeling. Spartacus did not offer speeches. He was not a philosopher, not a senator crafting oratory. His power came from gravity, the way he moved through camp with purpose, the way his orders were barked not for show but survival. He enforced discipline with terrifying precision. He permitted no looting, no rape, no chaos. Freedom, he insisted, would not be built on the ruins of their captors' sins, and slowly, impossibly, they began to resemble an army. Makeshift camps turned to organized encampments. Spears were fashioned from iron plowshares, for masons practiced, beneath olive groves, and Rome began to understand. The Senate scoffed at first, dispatching the praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber with 3,000 men. Veterans trained in suppressing unrest, they cornered the rebels at Mount Vesuvius, assuming the slope would trap them like dogs in a pit. But Spartacus did what no slave was supposed to do. He thought like a general. He ordered vines braided into ropes, scaled down the opposite cliff under darkness, and flanked the Roman camp from behind at dawn. The slaughter was surgical. Glaber's men were butchered before they could draw formation. Those who begged for mercy were shown the same as those who mocked the rebels. And for the first time, Rome felt something colder than fear, shame. A praetor had been humiliated, not by a rival consul, not by a barbarian chieftain, but by a man once bought like livestock in a market square. Spartacus offered no victory. Speech, he ordered the weapons collected, the bodies burned, and marched on. His followers swelled. 10,000, 20. The numbers grew beyond reckoning, and with them came questions. What did they want? To sack Rome, to claim territory, to become what they had overthrown. Spartacus, it is said, wanted none of it. He sought only escape. Northward, past the Alps, to Thrace, to home. Whatever home meant to a man remade by the furnace of captivity. But not all agreed. Crixus, the fierce Gallic fighter, believed destiny lay in conquest. Freedom meant nothing, he argued. Without vengeance, the divide would matter later. For now, they moved together, a tide swelling toward the impossible, and behind them. The Republic stirred, not in panic, not yet, but in irritation. This, they told themselves, was still a criminal band, a rebellion of brutes. But the smarter men, Crassus, Caesar, Pompey, they were watching, not with disdain, but with calculation. Because what Spartacus represented was not just a threat to Rome's safety. He was a threat to Rome's story, a slave who fought with honor, who led with discipline, who inspired loyalty. If such a man could rise, what did that say of their gods, their laws, their blood? Beneath the togas and scrolls, the empire began to tremble by the onset of winter. What began as a desperate sprint toward freedom had become an echoing crisis. In the corridors of Roman power, the roads that once pulsed with a steady march of legionnaires now carried rumors, and ashy towns left gutted in silence. Villas stripped of slaves and pride, patrician families fleeing southward under moonlight, dragging whatever coin and dignity they could carry. The Senate, once so certain in its condescension, found itself caught between disbelief and humiliation. Their maps, marked with confident red lines of imperial control, now featured strange and shifting pockets where the Republic no longer ruled. The mountains of Lucania, the valleys of Picenum, and the plains near Nola. These had become sanctuaries for the unthinkable armed slaves, who no longer feared the lictor's rod. And at the center of this moving shadow was Spartacus, no longer merely a rebel leader, but something harder to define, a man whose very existence broke the logic of Rome's order. His camp swelled beyond 30,000, then 40, and within its bounds, the strange miracle of structure took root. They forged makeshift councils. They distributed food with fairness. They buried their dead with rights stolen from half a dozen lands. And they trained, gods, did they train until men once born to break rock and mines could hold a shield line against Roman steel without faltering. But among their ranks, tensions festered like old wounds. Crixus, who had become both Spartacus's sword and thorn, chafed under the general's restraint. Why run? He would spit when we could burn. He wanted Rome's bones for kindling. Spartacus, ever silent at first, began to grow louder in command, drawing clearer lines between freedom and madness. He had no interest in conquest. He had seen too many empires collapse beneath their own weight to dream of building one from slaves. He believed in a single goal: to break northward, over the Alps, and vanish into the wild freedom of non-Roman lands. But war has a gravity that men underestimate. The longer they fought, the more they bled, the harder it became to leave. And all the while, Rome adapted. After humiliation by Glaber and then Verenius, both crushed by the rebels, the Senate turned to a man who understood ambition better than most: Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, a schemer whose wealth bought silence, loyalty, and when needed, violence. Crassus was not loved, but he was feared, and unlike his predecessors, he did not see Spartacus as a rabid dog to be cornered, but as a tactician to be outplayed. He raised new legions, 6, then 10, funded by his own coin, and more terrifyingly, he restored an ancient cruelty that chilled even the battle-hardened: decimation. When a Roman unit failed to stand its ground against the rebels, Crassus selected 1 in every 10 soldiers, not the cowards, but randomly, and had them beaten to death by their comrades. It was not justice, it was fear, weaponized, and under that fear, the legions became wolves. Spartacus sensed the shift. No longer was Rome sending pawns, now it sent hunters, and yet, he marched north, always north. He skirted the Adriatic coast, pillaged as little as possible, paid for grain where he could, punished those who preyed upon the weak, and built something horrifying in its suggestion: a disciplined insurgency. In the towns they passed, children no longer whispered of monsters in the woods. They whispered of Spartacus, of the man who once bore chains and now bore command, of a man who had given slaves something no one had dared give them before: memory. Rome had long counted on forgetting, on erasing, on blood that dried too quickly to stain the scrolls. But now, mothers in Samnium warned their sons not of wolves, but of the wrath of the freed. And yet, Spartacus was not a prophet. He was not invincible, and cracks began to spread. Some among his ranks demanded more than escape. They wanted to sack Rome itself. They saw the gates unguarded, the Senate trembling, the promise of gold and revenge. But Spartacus held back, not from fear, but from foresight. He had no siege equipment, no supply lines, no allies within the walls. To attack Rome was to dance on the blade of hubris. And so, they waited, trained, divided, and from behind them, Crassus began to close his jaws. In the bleak midwinter of 70 BC, As icy winds howled down from the Apennines and frost crept across the bones of the dead, the rebellion began to fracture beneath the weight of its own momentum. For nearly a year and a half, Spartacus had moved like a shadow through Italy, fighting more than a dozen engagements, scattering Roman forces, and outmaneuvering commanders who had once laughed at the notion of a slave-led army. But now the weight of survival pressed harder than the sting of iron. Food ran thin, shelter was scarce, and the dream of freedom began to frost over in the minds of those who followed him. The path to the Alps, once open, now seemed like a mirage behind them, an opportunity lost in the swirl of blood and indecision. The night was darkest in the campfires of Crixus's contingent, some 10,000 men who had splintered off, refusing to march north. They demanded conquest, not escape, revenge, not retreat. They turned southward toward Rome's vineyards and gold, toward slaughter. Spartacus begged them to reconsider. But war has a way of deafening men, and so they left, singing songs in tongues older than Latin, unaware that Crassus had already set his trap. The slaughter was total. Near Mount Garganus, the Gallic rebels were surrounded, outnumbered, and ground into red ash. Crixus fought like a storm, it is said, cutting through armored men with the desperation of prophecy. But valor does not halt Roman discipline. He fell, pierced by Pilla, his body stripped, and displayed as a warning. When word reached Spartacus, he said nothing for a long time. Then he wept, not as a leader, but as a man who had once called the dead his brother. And then, he did the unthinkable. He gathered to 100 captured Roman soldiers, forced them into a ring, and made them fight one another, not out of cruelty, but ritual and offering. He said, to honor Crixus. It was a message carved in blood. I know your games, Rome. I can play them too. It sent shivers through the legions, but the tides were turning. Crassus now controlled the southern routes, blocking any escape to Sicily, where Spartacus had once hoped to ferry his army and spark a broader slave revolt. The ships he'd bargained for, the Cilician pirates, betrayed him for coin. Vanishing into the mist, cornered, with tens of thousands under his care, Spartacus turned to strategy. He did not wait for Rome to descend. He struck first, hard and fast. A surprise assault on Crassus's forces at Picenum tore through the right flank, leaving the Roman supply lines smoldering. The rebellion had not lost its fire. But Crassus adapted. He ordered a trench and wall built across the narrowest part of Italy. From the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Ionian, over 30 miles of man-made barrier. Earth and wood, ditch and stake, slicing Calabria like a scar. It was not just a fence. It was humiliation. A cage built for men once thought beneath notice, and inside the cage, Spartacus paced. His army, once nearly 100,000 strong, had dwindled through desertion, hunger, and infighting. Still he inspired, still he led, but the future narrowed with each passing moon. Some whispered that he should surrender, others plotted to betray him, and yet, even now, he held the line. On a storm-slick night, with the Roman camp distracted by wind and rain, Spartacus led a desperate breakout, charging the wall, hacking through timber and flesh, dragging his army through mud and spear. Thousands died, but thousands broke free. They surged north again, a wounded beast gasping for a miracle. But Rome would not allow it. Crassus gave chase, and Pompey, returning from Spain with fresh legions and fresh ambitions, closed in. From the north, Spartacus now stood between the blades, both wielded by men who saw glory in his destruction. And yet he did not run. He did not yield. He turned and prepared to meet them, not for conquest, not for survival, but to carve into the earth a single, defiant truth that once a slave had made Rome bleed. The fields of Lucania, once dotted with olive trees and humming with harvest, had become a graveyard in waiting, a stretch of churned soil that now bristled with the cold tension of inevitability. It was here, in the damp spring of 71 BCE, that Spartacus prepared for what all in his army knew would be their final stand. The sky hung low and colorless, pregnant with silence, as if the earth itself held its breath. Around him, the remnants of a once mighty rebellion gathered, not in fear, but in a grim, unspoken understanding. They had outlasted senators and praetors. They had cut through the arrogance of generals and the weight of centuries-old chains. But now, Rome had come for them with its full wrath, and they were few, perhaps 30,000, maybe less, exhausted, starving, wounded, but still bearing the fire in their eyes that had terrified an empire. Spartacus stood among them, no longer just a symbol, no longer merely a leader, but a man stripped to his core, bound not by rank or ambition, but by conviction. He had refused to vanish into the forests of the north. He had chosen this field. He had chosen to meet death on his feet, sword in hand, with the full knowledge that the world would try to erase him again. Crassus had arrayed his legions in classic Roman form, heavy infantry in disciplined ranks, cavalry ready to flank, engineers manning the rear with reserves of pilla and towers of sharpened stakes. His men were confident, eager for closure, hungry for the glory of their general had promised. Crassus himself watched from a hilltop, his mouth a thin line, his eyes already calculating how history would remember him. He did not fear Spartacus now, not the man, but the idea, the myth, that had to be buried here, utterly. Before dawn, Spartacus addressed his men not with a speech of grandeur, but with quiet clarity. "We are already dead," he said. "The question is how we will be remembered." No banners were raised, no horns were blown. When the charge began, it was not a formation, but a storm, rebels pouring forward with every ounce of desperation, pride, and fury they had left. Spartacus led the front line himself, refusing to stand behind. He fought not like a commander, but like a man possessed, driving his blade through shield and flesh, pressing toward Crassus's command post with an almost suicidal clarity. He did not seek victory. He sought to mark the moment, to defy the silence that history would try to impose. Around him, his army crumbled. The legions encircled them with mechanical precision, driving wedges through their flank, cutting the lines into smaller and smaller pockets of resistance. But still they fought, in the mud, in the thorns, on broken spears and torn flesh. They fought. It is said that Spartacus reached within sight of Crassus before he fell. No one knows who struck the final blow. Some say it was a javelin, others a cavalryman's blade. His body was never identified among the thousands. Rome would claim that as victory, as proof that the rebellion had been just another outbreak of disorder. But the truth was stranger. Spartacus's body disappeared, not in glory, but in myth. His name lived on not in statues or triumphs, but in the terrified hush that passed through the Senate afterward, in the whispers among the slave markets of what had once been possible. Crassus crucified 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way, a grotesque forest of agony that stretched from Capua to Rome, a message carved into human bone. This is what defiance costs. For weeks, their bodies hung under the sun, food for crows and warnings for all. But the rebellion did not die with them. It festered, it inspired, it became story, dangerous, half-remembered, smuggled in songs and murmured at night in the servant quarters of villas. And in time, that story became more powerful than any sword. Spartacus had lost the war, but he had won something else. He had revealed Rome's greatest fear, that its power was built not on virtue, but on control, that its grandeur was maintained by shackles and silence, and that once, just once, a man who was never meant to speak had shouted with such force that the walls trembled. Long after the crucified had rotted down to twisted wirework skeletons along the Appian Way, long after the crows had abandoned the flesh for cleaner fields, the Roman elite still refused to speak the name aloud, Spartacus. To do so would have been to admit that the Republic, That sacred architecture of laws and honor and tradition had once trembled at the footfalls of those it called property. And so Rome turned to its preferred method of memory, erasure. Historians, under senatorial patronage, wrote of the uprising as a slave revolt, nothing more. Disorganized, violent, ultimately doomed. They painted Spartacus as a brute, or worse, as a mistake of fortune. A gladiator who got lucky. A rebel crushed before he became dangerous. But in the silence between those lines, the fear still lurked, because the deeper truth was harder to destroy. Spartacus had revealed the pressure points of the empire, exposed the lie that Rome's greatness came from divine favor or cultural superiority. It came, instead, from the backs of the beaten, the vast machinery of the Republic, the baths, the roads, the temples, the armies. All of it was built atop an underclass so enormous, so brutally silenced, that its revolt had almost seemed a myth until it marched. In the taverns of the plebeian districts, stories of the war lingered. Sailors told tales of the pirate ships Spartacus had once hired. Farmers remembered the winter when the slave army passed through their fields without looting. And among the slaves themselves, something changed, subtle at first, but irreversible. They had seen a man rise. They had seen a man bleed Rome. And they had seen that death was not always the end of a rebellion. Sometimes it was its beginning. Crassus would go on to reap the fruits of his brutal victory. The Senate hailed him, grudgingly, as the man who restored order. But in the shadow of Pompey's popularity and Caesar's rising ambition, Crassus's triumph soured. He died years later in Parthia, decapitated and humiliated, his head used as a prop in a foreign king's play. A fitting end. Some whispered, for the man who crucified ghosts. Pompey, though he claimed credit for mopping up the last of the rebels, could never quite shake the sense that his victories were over echoes, that the real war had passed him by. And as for Caesar, the youngest of the three, he watched and learned. He studied the rebellion not just as a military event, but as a glimpse into the heartbeat of power. He understood that loyalty could be inspired as easily by justice as by fear. A lesson he would one day turn against the Republic itself. But none of them could fully extinguish what Spartacus had ignited in distant provinces. Other revolts would flare, some crushed, some forgotten, but always haunted by the knowledge that one had come close to close. The legacy of Spartacus was not carved into stone or recited in Senate orations. It was whispered, burned into memory, etched into the soul of the oppressed. It passed from mother to son, from laborer to laborer, from scar to scar. It said, "They are not gods, they can bleed." And centuries later, when the empire itself collapsed, not from enemies at the gates, but from rot within, there were some who remembered that it had once nearly fallen to a man who had nothing, no land, no name, no right, in Roman eyes, even to his own breath. And yet, he had stood. That is the secret Rome never wished to confess, that in Spartacus they saw not a barbarian, but a mirror, a reflection of what they feared becoming. A man willing to sacrifice everything for a truth no empire could hold in chains. The man who defied them, and in doing so, forced them to see the cracks in their own greatness. The torchlight flickers in the grainy air, and you press yourself into the shadows of the fortress corridor, your bare feet silent against the cold stone. Above, through a grated window, the stars seem to tremble, clouds drifting like ash over the moon. You clutch the roll of stolen parchment to your chest, its wax seal still soft with heat, still carrying the smell of the emperor's private chambers. The knowledge you now possess is heavier than chains, an army already marching, a betrayal written in silk script, a secret alliance signed in the blood of your village's name. You feel the weight of it as if it were carved into your back, and yet you do not turn away. Through the quiet, a bell tolls once. Not from the tower, but deep below. A sound only the enslaved recognize. A call, passed hand to hand in kitchens, mines, and night stables, heard only by those whose ears were trained on sorrow. You are not alone anymore. You were never alone. A cloaked figure emerges from the archway ahead her eyes, once hollow with years of beaten silence, now burned with the same light you saw in your mother's final gaze. She says no words, only nods. The paper passes from your hands to hers. It is done. Not in triumph, not with drums or banners or songs, only silence. A silence deeper than history, a silence that carries the shape of rebellion. You slip away into the servants' hall, not as a slave now, but as a fire carried in flesh. And behind you, beneath the palace's cold foundations, something begins to move slow, like roots breaking stone. Something long buried, long forgotten, but breathing again.